Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. A new study has revealed that negative side effect warnings can increase sales. The study found that consumers tend to buy more of a product that advertises potentially harmful side effects, like weight gain and heart disease, than products that do not. Yeah, it seems the warnings had the paradoxical effect of creating trust in the consumer pig. This could help explain why David Cameron has brought forward by 3 months the Conservative Party Ponzi scheme, marketed under the name Help to Buy. The Ponzi scheme comes with economic health warnings from Mervyn King, Bank of England, the IMF, and from economists around the world that the program will destroy the UK economy. Despite the warning, greater fools are lining up to put just 5% down in a property worth up to £600,000 so that they, the taxpayer chump, will put down the remaining 15%. Pop open the bubbly, or as perhaps a bottle of Maggie. Maggie, Stacy, what's going on?
Max, it's called Our Maggie. It's a beer being sold at the Conservative Party conference. They're cheering the return of the housing bubble. PM triggers new house sales spree. 200,000 get chance to buy as Cameron starts £12 billion mortgage guarantee scheme next week. Prime Minister yesterday announced Help to Buy scheme will start from next week, 3 months ahead of schedule. Quote, I will not stand by while hard-working people struggle to get a mortgage, but critics say dangerous scheme will inflate the market.
Well, there's a couple of things here. One is, as you point out in the opening, people tend to gravitate toward things that are bad for them. So when they advertise drugs that have negative side effects, people tend to gravitate toward those things. You know, on cigarette packages, the more cancer-ridden lungs they put on the package, the greater people tend to want to smoke. And this is part of the behavioral economics that are used by governments to induce people to do things that they don't want to do. Because we live in this casino gulag now, and the rule of the casino is that the emotional kick from losing is greater than the emotional kick from winning. And so casinos know this. This is why people tend to get addicted to gambling, is the emotional kick of losing. They are, in effect, addicted to losing. Now, flash forward to George Osborne and David Cameron's Ponzi scheme. It's a loser, but people are addicted to it. They know it's bad for them. And remarkably, because the opposition leader, Ed Miliband, had such a strong speech at his conference, they're so desperate over there in the coalition camp, the Tory and the Liberal Democrat camp, that they're moving forward this Ponzi scheme by 3 months. It shows you that this is not an economic policy. It's a help to buy votes policy. Help to buy votes. It's shameless pandering to the casino gulag, to the worst elements of British society. And I think Cameron will go. And today, I think, or this week, I should say, is the anniversary of Neville Chamberlain, who famously appeased the Nazis during the 1930s. I think here you have David Cameron appeasing the house price builders and the banks in the city, who are effectively the equivalent in today's screwed up global economy.
Well, in fact, okay, you mentioned a few things there, but the housing bubble, all economists will agree, housing bubbles and collapses are the worst for economies, more than just normal cyclical boom and bust recessions in the business cycle. So we've just gone through 5 years, we're now 5-6 years into a global economic collapse. And what do? They want to spur it again. Well, an estimated 200,000 people are expected to get a chance to purchase a house worth up to £600,000 with a deposit of just 5%. The government will underwrite an additional 15% of the loan to make the deal attractive to lenders. The £12 billion initiative will last for 3 years. So that's the important thing, is to make it attractive to lenders. It's buying votes, because a lot of people are stoned and high and taking crocodile of the mortgage market. But it's really about the lenders. They're the ones that aren't lending because they know that anybody who can only put down a 5% deposit is very likely to not pay the rest of the mortgage.
Right. Well, you know, flash forward to 3 years from today. Somebody put up 20 or 30,000 pounds to get a house. Will be sitting on a house that now has a 500 or 600,000 pound liability. They can't sell it. They're underwater by hundreds of thousands of pounds with negative equity in that house. So this is a guaranteed scheme to bring about huge numbers. Remember, Northern Rock and Bradford and Bingley, 2 banks here in the UK, went bankrupt because of the same scheme from 10 years ago, leading up to the house bubble and pop of the mid-2000s. People completely forget why Northern Rock went bust, because of a Ponzi scheme called the housing bubble. Same thing with Bradford and Bingley. Now they want to reinflate this. The only question is which bank will go bankrupt. Well, maybe one of the big ones this time, like HSBC or Barclays or Lloyd's, or one of the others will go bust as a result.
Faisal Islam from Channel 4 was looking at some of the data from the FSA, and they provided data about what happened during the 2005 to 2007 housing bubble. And what they found was that first-time buyers, their average loan-to-value of the home mortgage was 83%. Now, these are targeted towards people who have to take a loan-to-value of 95%. So he also then goes on to tweet, at 95% LTV, loan-to-value, reported mortgage difficulties shot up rapidly. 30% for FTB, which is first-time buyer, and astonishing 50% for remortgagers. And during the last housing bubble, the majority of the mortgages taken out were actually remortgagers, i.e. people trying to avoid working for a living. They were taking out those unearned gains of £110 a day. They were extracting equity. So that was the majority of them. And anybody who was doing a 95% loan-to-value remortgage, 50% of them failed to pay.
Right. Well, there's two classes of people in Britain right now. They're the people on benefits through the housing bubble,
yes,
that are getting more than £100 a day from Osborne and Cameron and the Bank of England, Mark Carney.
Yes.
Their houses are moving up £100 a day through this bubble, through this Ponzi scheme, and then they can use that to extract equity. They can go to the bank, they can take out £100 a day because that's the value of the house going up that day due to the Ponzi scheme that is in effect now. Then there's another group of people on benefits, the people in the NHS who have been kicked off the NHS, or the people who are being thrown out of their spare bedrooms, the people on the welfare system here in the UK. Those people would have not been given the opportunity to have jobs or to have savings accounts paying them 4 or 5% interest. That's where the money is coming from. So you have two people on benefits, the people that are the scroungers, as they're called in the UK, and then you have the scroungers who are in the housing bubble. And there is nobody in the middle anymore. There's nobody actually making a middle class, a legitimate life, who's working for a living in a decent way. You have only speculators and the underclass, the permanent underclass, the people that are trying to be exterminated by this Ponzi scheme.
Well, that's a good point, because also with this Conservative Party conference happening, George Osborne has announced a plan that anybody on benefits for more than 9 months, and that's £56 per week over the course of 7 days, £56. Well, he's saying that they have to work at basically unpaid labor, so they have to, clean up trash or litter or graffiti or make meals for the elderly. Whereas all of these people who are earning £110, well, it's unearned income. They're being given by the taxpayer £110 income. It's not only through these subsidies, whether it's funding for lending or Help to Buy or the Help to Buy 2, which is coming up, but it's also because of their planning restrictions to prevent anybody else from developing and building new homes, so that these ones in the market on the so-called ladder get to have this unearned income. What happens to them? Why aren't they out? They should be working 50, 60 hours a day because they're making £110 per day.
Right. Well, there's an adversarial relationship now between the Bank of England, the City of London, housing developers, lenders, and the real estate brokers on one side of the divide, the apartheid divide. And on the other side are people who are not speculating and beneficiaries of this Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
And those people, as Osborne now wants to put them to work at the effective rate of £2 per hour.
Yep.
He wants to create, a permanent underclass in Britain.
Well, if he weren't trying to do that, they would do this Help to Buy scheme at 100%. Or 110%, like Bradford and Bingley used to do. Because you still have to come up with 5% deposit. And still, only the middle class, actually only upper middle class at the prices in London can afford to put that 5% deposit down. So they should make it 100%, that the government will back 100%, because otherwise they're excluding these people that are on the benefits for unemployment. So why don't you get those people off unemployment, shift them into £110 earnings per day on the housing market, just give them a 100% mortgage. Maybe that will solve both of the problems with one stone.
Well, look, the Bank of England has accumulated during the last 5 years of this crisis more than £3 trillion of debt funding these George Osborne-like Ponzi scheme programs. The Bank of England could simply look at the other part of the economy, the people that are not speculating in the housing market, that are working for a living, and he could quadruple minimum wage, funded by the same money from the Bank of England. Therefore, you'd have a middle class, you'd have GDP expansion, and you'd have people buying houses that they normally do. But he doesn't like those people. He has contempt for those people. He's trying to exterminate those people. He only favors the people in the City of London. That's why the Tory party is the party of toffs and a party of the ne'er-do-wells and the Lord Granthams of the world from Downton Abbey, who sit on their duff all day. They're dossers who do absolutely nothing.
Well, it also shows you the financialization of the world and the economy and our politics, because they're saying it's a 12 billion pound scheme, but that 12 billion pounds of taxpayer money is being used to underwrite 130 billion pounds of mortgages. That shows you the leverage that they could apply. This is why they favor these sort of policies as well, because if they were going to use it for capital expenditure to actually build infrastructure here, they would actually have to pay cash up front, because these guys aren't going to work on leverage. The actual guys making the buildings and the railroads.
Right, with the 12 billion pounds they're allocating to the banks to create $120 billion worth of Ponzi loans is exactly, give or take $1 billion, the amount of money they're taking from the so-called benefits and scroungers in the UK.
Yeah.
That they're not scroungers. I mean, they're no less scroungers than any scapegoated community in any kind of Ponzi scheme economy run by kleptocrats and psychopaths. They're just people who want to make a decent living. Maybe they don't want to participate in a banking system that rewards kleptocracy.
And then finally, along these same lines of these unearned benefits, well, the Fed's gift to American business, this is from Business Week, and they say the U.S. Federal Reserve's efforts to boost the economy by holding down interest rates has saved corporate America $700 billion in interest payments over the past 4 years.
Right, well, once again, you have a situation where artificially keeping interest rates low benefits one class of people. Essentially, the global economy now is all running from the same playbook. It's a battle between assets and wages. And wages are being sacrificed to pump up asset bubbles. And just like a game of musical chairs, when the bubble pops, a few people have a chair, they make money, they're the new winners, whether it's Facebook or the Google guys. They were the beneficiaries of the last Ponzi scheme. And then there are millions of people who are castigated into permanent poverty as a result of that. They could very simply do the exact same thing, but for wage earners, and they would have a more equitable society. But they're rolling the dice that society won't rise up and have them all, burned at the stake. And so far, they're winning. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half, a whole lot more.
Business news, reviews, economic ups and downs from the finance hub of Moscow to London, New York, Shanghai and the rest of the globe. Join me, Katie Pilbeam, every week on RT.
5 seconds. And over the mic is all feeling go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track alpha. Roll alpha.
In fact, the single biggest threat facing our nation today is the corporate takeover of our government and our press.
Stand by, camera one.
We've been hijacked by a handful of powerful transnational corporations that will profit by destroying what our founding fathers once built up. I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show, we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem. We try to fix it. Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera, go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture.
There's was a 9-story building. I noticed that standing on its roof was a man in civilian clothes holding a sniper rifle.
They had to say something in their defense. So they lied that they had used blank or wooden shells. But the building was burning. You remember how much time it took to restore it?
We voted for Yeltsin in the referendum. Deputies of the Supreme Soviet didn't appeal to us at all. We had to support Yeltsin, otherwise it would have been civil war.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Sydney and speak with the second most popular economist in Australia that goes by the name of Doss. He's also the author of Extreme Money. Hello, Doss.
Hello, Max. Who's the most popular economist in Australia?
I think I am. I think I'm the most popular economist in Australia. But we'll get to that in a moment. I want to ask you, Doss, why didn't the Fed taper?
Well, I think in the end, Mr. Bernanke tried it, and it was a nice try on, but I think two things. One is long-end rates backed up quite a bit, and he thought that would risk truncating the recovery. That's number one. Number two, I think it set off problems in other parts of the world with European yields going up and emerging markets starting to look shaky as capital flowed out. So all of that would probably have come into the calculation. And also in the end, I think Mr. Bernanke sort of took one look around the table and said, well, actually, I don't want to end up being outvoted in my own Fed, because I think there wasn't a lot of support for it.
Yeah, well, how did you say you didn't want to truncate the recovery? When you use the term recovery, what are you referring to? I mean, you're not saying that anything has happened in the last 5 years other than a reinflating of the bubble, correct? There hasn't been any true underlying real economic activity, correct, Doss?
Well, I don't think the Fed or any of the policymakers now deal in the real economy. They pay it lip service. But you're absolutely correct. There's a reflation of the bubble and financial asset prices. And remember what Bernanke has said in testimony before is that what they're trying to do is use the trickle-down effect. You know, let's bump up the stocks and houses, and maybe people will start to spend, maybe the economy will recover. You're quite correct. There's a disjunction between the real economy and the financial economy.
But here in the UK, Doss, the house prices are moving up about £100 a day, and then people extract that from their homes using the loan value of the home to go out and spend, to go out and use that as a consumer spend. And so the government has said, you know, this is a great Ponzi scheme. Let's only require a 5% down so that people can continue this Ponzi scheme of borrowing against their home. Why doesn't the government go to 100% mortgage total guarantee to allow 100% of the economy to go out there and leverage their home to consume? Why are they stopping at just a 5% Ponzi scheme threshold? Why not 100? Or remember going back to Northern Rock and Bradford and Bingley, they offered 110% mortgages. Why not go that route, Doss, instead of this pretense that they are in fact trying to encourage anything other than massive Ponzi scheme building here in the UK?
Look, I think you're absolutely correct. Why stop at 95% leverage? I think, let's be honest, I think the policies that are in place just showed the, I suppose, poverty of economic thinking and also the lack of alternatives. I think we've tried fiscal reflation, doesn't work, so we're just printing money now through quantitative easing, though people don't like to call it that. We've got zero interest rates. I mean, the cupboard's pretty bare. And so we are now going back to what we were in 2007 or 2006 and just basically trying to use debt to actually reflate the economy. Now, I think, wasn't it Albert Einstein who once said that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is kind of the sign of madness? This is just madness. The real interesting thing is this is going to continue. And I think the real cycle, which is really interesting here, is we now live in a world which is QE forever. And you remember the wonderful song by the Beatles, Strawberry Fields Forever, let me take you down to a place where nothing is real. That's where we are. And we're going to just get caught in this for a very long period of time, as did Japan. And we're going to see the cycle. Economy improves a bit, which is asset prices go up, there's modest growth. Oh, we'll taper, says the central bank. Interest rates go up, recovery slows down. Oh, we can't do that, so we'll basically open the taps again. Oh, it's getting better, we'll turn the taps back down again. Oh, it's not doing that. We're just going to be caught in this loop. And to be honest, I don't think any of us really know how this loop ends, because the story is still playing in Japan, though the circumstances there are a little different.
Let's talk about these markets as a Ponzi scheme, not from kind of a descriptive metaphor, but as an actual Ponzi scheme. Now, in a Ponzi scheme, fresh money is required to pay off the people leaving the Ponzi scheme. And the pyramid scheme, as it's also known, the base must always be bigger and bigger and bigger. Once the base of the Ponzi scheme starts to diminish, the entire thing collapses like a house of cards. And that's why there was no taper, because any reduction in money printing will collapse every major bank's balance sheet in the world to nothing. So walk us through now, going forward, how the Fed and the central banks around the world are not only going to not taper, but they're going to increase their monthly asset purchases and Ponzi schemes. It's going to go up, isn't it, Das?
Well, it's more likely than not it'll at least stay where it is. They might have to increase it. You're quite correct. The actual scale has to keep increasing to keep the thing going. And that's what Japan tells us. You can't stop once you start to do this. Now, the interesting thing, what they'll do is how they go about that, because they may start to use different strategies, calling it different things. And I think one of the key things that you're seeing is, in a strange way, the ECB has already hinted at it. They keep doing these long-term refinancing operations where they keep terming it out. They just keep terming out the actual money, lowering the rates, and you'll have to have some accommodation on the other side, which is the excessive debt that's in the system. And you're seeing signs of that in Europe, where basically nobody wants to take a haircut. So what they're actually going to do is very interesting. They're going to make these like 99-year loans with 0 interest rates. And this will sort of go along with the pretense that we're actually not writing down anything. So you'll see accommodation both at the debt side, you'll see actual expansion of money through the central bank in different ways. One of the most interesting ones that you'll see in terms of reflation and expanding the base is some debates which are taking place. For instance, the debate in Washington that is taking place that I'm aware of is, if the Treasury is issuing debt and the central bank is buying it, and it's all part of the same government, why don't we just join the two and wipe out the debt? So you can start the game all over again. So we'll see some games around that. The other thing you're going to see is, obviously, the effect depends on what assets you buy. They've been buying high-quality assets, but as you know, in Japan, they migrated from high-quality assets to stocks, to other sorts of things. So we'll see all of those types of things go on. So for the people who play around in financial markets, it's going to be kind of a fun time, provided you can time your decisions properly. But in terms of the real economy, for the ordinary Joe public, this is actually a deadly game, where ultimately they're going to have to pay the price of these excesses somewhere down the track.
Well, Das, you mentioned this idea of canceling the debt, where the Treasury and the Fed get together and simply nullify the debt. But that's impossible, because you have an institution like JP Morgan with off-balance sheet items that are shared by the Federal Reserve Bank. They are sharing a balance sheet of $90 trillion worth of derivatives that JP Morgan uses as collateral to buttress their Ponzi scheme, their books. If, in fact, there was an agreement between the Fed and the Treasury, then are we willing to say that JP Morgan, we're sacrificing JP Morgan? We're willing to throw JP Morgan under the bus and let the stock go to 0, like Enron or WorldCom, like the dangerous Ponzi scheme that it is? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that at all, because ultimately in financial markets, if everybody's willing to ascribe a value to it, then it doesn't really matter. What you're talking about here is the central bank has negative equity. When you actually do this, the central bank basically loses an enormous amount of value. Now, if you're correct in what the line of thinking you're going down, you're saying these actual collateral, these bonds have no value because the central bank issuing them hasn't got any substance. But the real issue is we can all pretend that's not an issue, and then we can still ascribe value to it. And as long as we can keep the banks liquid, because ultimately banks fail because A, a lack of confidence and a lack of liquidity as people withdraw money. As long as we can maintain that, because it's more comfortable for everybody to maintain that, we can keep it going. There will come a moment, which is the moment that you're talking about, when this all unwinds, but we are a long way from that at the moment.
But Das, the Fed is already leveraged 50-1. The Fed is already at negative equity. The Fed is already losing money on their bond portfolio if you use, mark-to-market adjusting and not mark-to-fantasy adjusting. JP Morgan has negative equity. They're already, all those major banks are already underwater. The Deutsche Bank is even worse than J.P. Morgan. Isn't the policy of these policy makers simply to just wait until the next thing blows up? Because remember, Alan Greenspan, who was the Fed chairman before Ben Bernanke, said, well, you know, we can make the bubbles appear, but we have no idea when they pop, and we have no policy to deal with them when they pop. All we can do is inflate a bubble. So isn't the policy just to wait for Deutsche Bank to go bust, let the economy crash again, let there be a civil war somewhere, start a few more wars, and then figure out what to do later? Isn't that the policy? The policy is we have no policy. Isn't that correct?
We don't have a strategy, but we have tactics. And the tactic is, in terms of banks and sovereigns are no longer different. Certainly the too big to fail banks are basically exactly the same as the sovereign. So you're talking, when you're talking about JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank, something very akin to the sovereign. So as long as we can keep this game going, at least as a tactical level, that's what they're going to do.
Let's talk about quotes from Warren Buffett, who recently said that the U.S. Federal Reserve is the greatest hedge fund in the world. Now, Warren Buffett meant that as a compliment. Your thoughts?
Oh, well, I think they are a hedge fund. But then if you actually look at the consequences of that, it's very interesting. Because if the Fed is a hedge fund and it essentially holds a lot of U.S. treasuries, you can say that China's a hedge fund as well, because the Chinese central bank owns a truckload of these as well. So basically, when you're talking about the underlying premise of an inflating bubble of credit, well, every official institution which can do this and leverage itself up to the gills is a hedge fund. We live in a hedge fund world. And that's because we have never, ever dealt with the fundamental problem that we needed to deal with, which is the excessive debt, debt-driven growth, the imbalances, the entitlements. Nobody wants to deal with any of those because that would mean a drop in living standards. And no politician anywhere in the world wants to go around saying, well, you're going to lose 30 or 40% of your living standard. So they try to do it by stealth, by other mechanisms. And that's what we're seeing. So the world is full of these hedge funds. You're quite correct. But it's all right as long as we all pretend that they're solvent and we pretend that the game can go on.
No, yeah, but the people in Greece, they can't pretend anymore. They're starving to death, and they've got neo-Nazism on the rise, and there's death and destruction. The people in the people in the UK and Britain who are being thrown out of their homes, who are being suffering by having their NHS privatized. They can't pretend like everything's great. In other words, this Ponzi scheme is being fed by the willful social re-engineering of societies in a way we haven't seen since Germany in the 1930s. This is a complete pogrom of the lower classes to feed the Ponzi schemes and Warren Buffett. And if he calls the Federal Reserve Bank a Ponzi scheme, isn't he then calling the Federal Reserve Bank the next long-term capital management, which of course famously went bust back in the late 90s, early 2000s. You covered in your book, Extreme Money. And this is exactly the same thing, but much bigger. Why does Buffett think that it's a good idea to have another long-term capital management at the heart of the global economy and the world's reserve currency, Das?
Let me tell you something. The people who mine don't matter, and the people who matter don't mine. And you're quite correct. This is no longer an economic crisis. This is a political and social crisis about the bankruptcy of a system which basically does not want to confront the real issue.
All right, Das. We'll have to back on again soon to talk more specifically about Australia, where you are the second most famous economist in Australia. Das, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
After you. I understand you're the most famous one.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Das, author of Extreme Money. If you want to contact us via Twitter, go to Keiser Report on Twitter. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.